There's been a lot of talk, hasn't there, about areas where the UK is world-beating, and some of it has, frankly, been nonsense. But let's have a look at an area where certainly it is true. When it comes to vaccinations, the UK has very high levels of vaccines. This is showing the proportion of people who are double jabbed just over the course of that vaccine programme. So it's going higher and higher. And you can see, let's just look at that UK line. It's higher than most other countries around the world when it comes to the proportion of people who have got two vaccinations. So that line is very high. But it does raise a question, doesn't it? Why are we seeing cases rising so high in the UK? If we take those same countries and look at just cases per million of the population, well, that's what you see, a striking increase in those numbers for the UK, cases going a lot higher than all those other countries. So why is that? The UK has so many people vaccinated, and yet you're seeing cases rising, particularly, well, certainly among people who are double jabbed. So a lot of people who have two vaccines still actually getting COVID-19. So does that mean something's going wrong? Does that mean the vaccines aren't working? Or is something else happening? Well, for this, you need to remember that vaccines broadly are aimed to do two things. So you've got, first of all, protecting you from infection, so protecting you actually getting the disease. Secondly, protecting you from the consequences of it. So meaning it's not going to be as severe. You might not have to go to hospital. And those are two separate things. And there are different kind of data points on how effective these vaccines are on them. This is latest data from Public Health England. It's talking about the vaccines that are instituted in the UK. So we're talking about AstraZeneca and Pfizer and looking at the average here. And the bars, the higher these bars are, the more effective they are against these different things. So we're going to look at effectiveness against infection. You can see single jabbed, 49% effective against infection, double jabbed, 89% against infection. Now, this is for the alpha variant, so the first variant that was in the UK around winter, so that's the Kent variant. And you can see you're up to 89% effective, but if you just look specifically at the Delta variant, so this new variant, the Indian variant, as some people call it, that effectiveness against infection is lower. The bars aren't getting as close to that 100%. You're only up to 79%, even if you're double jabbed. So still a significant chance of getting the disease. But then there's the second thing. So not just infection, but severity. And where do those vaccines rate on that axis? Well, you can see here, look, this is the same thing again. The higher these bars are, the more effective the jabs are with each of these variants against hospitalisation. And look, with the single jab, you're up to 78% effective against hospitalisation, 93% effective with two jabs. But just look at Delta. So in this sense, actually, it's a bit better. You can see 96% effective against hospitalisation. If I just kind of focus specifically on those bars, so we're just looking at Delta here, just look, you still have a 21% chance of being infected, even if you are double jabbed, whereas your chance of being hospitalised is 4% compared with those who are unvaccinated. So that's pretty crucial. You're talking about two things. Still pretty porous when it comes to cases. And if we just work this through a little bit more, look at the number of people who are vaccinated around the UK and just think about the fact that, a chunk of these people might well get COVID-19. Well, fully vaccinated, you've got 36 million or so, just over 36 million. Those who are single dose, 10.2 million. Then you've got that proportion of unvaccinated adults. So this is over 18s who are unvaccinated, about 6.6 million. And of course, many of those measures that the Prime Minister's been talking about with checks on people going into nightclubs, that's potentially to try and encourage those people, mostly younger people who are unvaccinated. And then you've got under 18s as well. But bear in mind, obviously we saw those numbers a moment ago. Even if you're double jabbed, there's still a 21% chance of getting it. So that means about 7.6 million people who could potentially get COVID-19. There's other things, I should say, going on. There's question marks about how resistant you are if you have antibodies, if you've caught the disease previously, and this is a big simplification. But nonetheless, I'm trying to underline the fact that still a lot of people might well get COVID, even if they've been double jabbed. And then 65% chance of getting the infection, obviously, if you have a single dose. So 65% of that is about 6.6 million. And add that all up, OK, and you're talking about 14 million, just over 14 million potential infections among people who have been vaccinated. And that's why we're likely to see a lot of stories about people who've been vaccinated who have actually got the disease, whereas you've got unvaccinated, that proportion of the population much lower. Final thing worth mentioning is within this cohort of fully vaccinated people, you're seeing elderly people who are more vulnerable to the disease, who are potentially more likely to die, sadly, of COVID-19. So that story it's a nuanced one, but it's worth bearing in mind because it's not just about protecting you from actually getting the disease, it's also about protecting you from hospitalisation. And when we see that, when you look at these lines showing you case numbers, that's case numbers across the UK, you can see they're going up very sharply, potentially not as high as they were in the winter peak, but they are pretty likely to get there, frankly. And then you've got hospitalisations. So it's on a different axis here, but you can see how correlated that red line is with the dark blue line throughout winter. But just look at what's happened more recently. So cases going up very sharply, admissions certainly going up, but not as sharply as they did around the time of the last wave. And while they are likely to go higher, the question is how much higher, and the same obviously goes for cases. If we look around the UK, there are hotspots which give us clues as to where we might be heading. So, for instance, look, we'll go here to the northeast. You can see Redcar and Cleveland. You've got 1,563 cases per 100,000. That's the highest level in the UK, so a real hotspot around that South Tees area there. You can see Middlesbrough, 1,404 cases. And the darker, obviously, these areas are, the higher the levels of COVID-19 infections there. If we look around that South Tees area, so includes Middlesbrough, Redcar as well, and just have a look at cases versus hospitalisations. So the same chart I showed you a moment ago, there you can see cases, look, wow, they are much higher than they were in the winter, the highest I think they've ever been in this area. But now add on hospitalisations, you can see very correlated through the winter, but now they are going up. They are certainly going up. Look at how steep that line is. But whereas cases are higher than they have ever been before, hospitalisations still considerably lower than that peak in the winter. So that's encouraging, and it underlines that point we've just seen here, that there's two things going on. There's the spreading of the disease, where the vaccines aren't quite as effective, but then there's hospitalisations where they are a lot more effective. Two different things, two different paths that we're talking about with the vaccines. Finally, worth saying, you know, there is some regional variation around the UK. If you go up, for instance, to the Orkney Islands, you're talking about 49 cases per 100,000, very low levels in Wales as well. But the expectation is that as we see lockdown ending, those numbers are going to go higher, and we're going to have to keep monitoring all these charts.